are you? Who are you? Ohayou gozaimasu. And welcome to my review, my take on Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Cure. This is a review that I think is a little bit overdue on my part. This is a very significant film in 90s Japanese cinema, and certainly in the career and critical standing of its director. And it's been released in different countries by different labels, not the least of which recently by Criterion. So my thoughts and feelings on this film are called for, I think. So let's jump into what is, I think, as I said, one of the most significant films of its era, representative of said era, 90s era Japanese cinema, in several different ways. And as more and more Kurosawa Kiyoshi films are becoming available, and with more slated, early next year there will be a release of one of his most recent films, Cloud, alongside another key 90s film, Charisma. So as this filmmaker gets more and more international acclaim and traction and visibility, let's have a look at one of the key films, if not the key film, that sort of began and in some ways instigated the international sort of visibility and following of this great director. So Cure, like Kitano Takeshi's similarly epochal Hanabi, was made in 1997. And I think we could argue this marks a turning point for Japanese cinema. Not in the least because, due to the success of films like Hanabi and Cure and one or two others, the national industry of Japan, its filmmaking industry, returned to something like international acclaim and visibility after a lot of years where only the most notable sort of canonized auteurs were able to make any headway at international film festivals and on international screens. As I said, the international cinematic reputation of Kurosawa was cemented with Cure. And I think this film, as well as several key others, is a great introduction because it suggests the extent to which his cinema is rooted in genre filmmaking, and specifically in the horror film. Although his more recent work has strayed away from J-horror as much as it has employed it, I think his name was made on a series of what are ostensibly horror thrillers, albeit ones that use the horror genre as a vehicle to examine deep philosophical questions about human identity, and that use the genre's typical iconography and narrative patterns in a subjective manner. In other words, as a way of visualizing concepts related to the director's abiding concerns with the vicissitudes of identity at the confluence of social and political forces. In Cure, the familiar investigation into the mind and practices of a serial killer, something that in 1997 had become both internationally acclaimed, think of films like The Silence of the Lambs, Seven, Kiss the Girls, on the one hand, and nationally enshrined in Japanese cinema through works like Angel Dust or Marks, as well as the anime Perfect Blue, becomes a vehicle for an exploration of selfhood as a social construction. What do we mean when we say I? What does that I relate to, what kind of markers of identity are brought to bear. And this is something that the ostensible antagonist, the monster, the serial killer of Cure, throws into relief. It's something that he repeatedly asks and repeatedly facilitates the asking of in those with whom he comes into contact. So Cure concerns a mysterious young man named Mamiya, played by Hagiwara Masato, who seems, through suggestion, to be inciting seemingly ordinary members of the public, both men and women, to commit murder, after which they carve a cross in their victims' bodies and cannot explain why they've done what they've done. A weary detective named Takabe, played by Kurosawa regular and frequent on-screen alter ego Yakusho Koji, who is struggling with the domestic travails of caring for a mentally ill wife, not unlike Kitano Takeshi's protagonist in Hanabi, as well as working alongside a cynical police psychologist, takes up the case, and in so doing he becomes increasingly aggravated by the pursuit and subsequently with his inability to get to grips with the stubborn and unfathomable nature of his quarry, of his abilities, and indeed his motivation for doing what he's doing. This mysterious young serial killer or facilitator of serial killings becomes something like a question mark throughout Cure. He is a tabula rasa, if you like, upon whom a series of personality traits are projected, and who, more importantly, becomes someone who reflects similar traits back on those with whom he comes into contact. So he's like a mirror that is held up to various characters. Some commentators, principally here I'm thinking of the notable critic of Japanese cinema and culture Donald Ritchie, have seen this character as someone with evil supernatural powers. But I think this is very much ambiguous and remains open to question. And if you know other Kurosawa horror films like Seance or Doppelganger or Pulse, I think this marked ambiguity is something that is very much in keeping with his work as a whole. This young man's repeated refrain or question when he encounters the people that he incites to murder is, "Who are you?" And what he asks, and the film by extension asks, is what motivates human action? What fuels or facilitates identity formation? Is identity a secure, autonomous phenomenon? Or is it something that is amorphous, that is perennially unstable, perennially open to construction, to fabrication, to suggestion, as it were, if we take the line of hypnosis here? In this, I think Cure more than upholds the claims about the socio-political import of horror that have long been made by notable critics like Richard Lipp and especially Robin Wood. And for this reason, it really does stand out in Japanese cinema. I think where concerns about potentially socio-political topics of gender have tended to predominate in J-horror, here there are much wider questions, much more philosophical necessarily than socio-political, that Kurosawa is interested in framing and in asking. The subject of hypnotism, as I said, is repeatedly raised here. It's raised in the narrative. The character talks about the German physicist Franz Mesmer and his experiments in what were termed animal magnetism. And this is something that Mamiya is very familiar with. But this point is made by the psychologist that is aiding Yakusho's protagonist, that anyone being hypnotized cannot be made to act in a way that contravenes their own sense of personal morality. Someone cannot be induced to do something under hypnosis that they wouldn't otherwise be capable of. It's interesting, this point of view comes from a character, a professional character, whose relevance is ultimately undermined and who is ultimately made quite redundant narratively. I think Kurosawa uses him as a means of raising, if only to decry and negate any neat or pat answers or conclusions, and making us aware in so doing of our own complicity in the proceedings by stressing our need as viewers to read, as it were, or decode what it is that we're seeing, to take at face value this notion of hypnotic suggestion and come to our own conclusions if we find that neat and pat and unsatisfying. So to my mind, I think the idea that Mamiya is evil incarnate, almost like some slasher film character, flies in the face of the subtlety and the creeping, pervasive sense of unease that Kurosawa builds and develops throughout Cure. The sort of languorous, penetrating gaze into the abyss of human action and interaction that he wants to probe and examine. If this character is evil, then to what extent are his actions dissociable from those of his nominal victims? Are they also evil? If we take the idea that they can't be hypnotized into committing murder unless they would have been willing to do that anyway, then this notion of evil is one that immediately becomes complex and, to say the least, problematic. The fact that Mamiya seems to materialise from nowhere in the opening scene on a beach, much like the figure of death in Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, suggests that he may be read as symbolic, not as flesh and blood. But he does remain a corporeal figure. And the fact that he does so suggests a kind of Cartesian duality at work here that sets mind against body and implies almost a post-human landscape of effect over cause. As in Kurosawa's later sort of parodic eco-thriller, Charisma, and indeed something like Woman of the Dunes, there is an existential fable at the heart here of the narrative. Characters are stripped of the accoutrements of civilization, a way perhaps of returning the world to the state of a supposedly prelapsarian idyll. That's something that many of the characters in Charisma are desirous of effecting. But the past here is apparent only insofar as it has been, or can be, recorded. A videotape of an 1898 medical film that looks forward to the killings cements any link or suggests a link between violence and media saturation, which is another sort of thematic avenue here that is tantalisingly sort of bubbling under the surface, so that the past bleeds into the present, and the distinction between them and every other aspect of the film's narrative and its characters becomes again blurred and ambiguous. Typically for Kurosawa, the film wears this philosophical inquiry quite lightly, his brooding sense of dread never standing in the way of a tonal volte-face that erupts as a corrective to any straightforward sense of genre or meaning derived therefrom. Or should I say, a cure of the same rather than a corrective. With this in mind, we turn to the title. One may begin reflecting on this film by asking not only what the cure is, but in turn, what exactly is being cured, and indeed, who is subject to being cured. Perhaps who or what is offering a cure. Asking these questions helps frame the specific, subtle, and disquieting experience of this film. Kurosawa has talked often of his favourite Hollywood films, genre films made by directors like Sam Peckinpah, Don Siegel, Richard Fleischer, Robert Aldrich, as ones in which there is a specific tension between the clean and classical lines of said genre cinema and the complex thematic inquiries that several films by these directors explore that belies any sense of a familiar or predictable narrative format or narrative experience. For Kurosawa, these questions pertain, I think, directly to cinema itself. Identity and motivation, who are the characters, why do they behave as they do, which are central questions that we ask of characters and we are presented with as part of characterization in cinema generally, provide a touchstone and a point of departure throughout Cure. And this impacts not only on its investigative narrative, but its place within genre cinema, potentially its commentary on genre cinema. As I've said, the ostensible antagonist of the film repeatedly asks of those to whom he becomes an interlocutor who they are. And speaking to the detective towards the end of the film, he probes the different ways by which this detective defines himself. Is he a detective, a husband? Which of these is more important? Are they completely mutually exclusive, or is there some sense of connection between them? So he's asking how the constituent facets of his life and identity add up and the extent to which they cohere in the person of a single character. It's a pointed question in general, but in the context of an ostensible genre film here, Kurosawa asks questions that disturb how we engage with and consume films, for which the pre-packaging of a particular experience, i.e. a genre film, is paramount. Kurosawa has frequently talked of Yakusho as someone like himself, representative of the generation of Japanese who came of age at a crucial point in the country's post-war history, following the failures of the leftist student revolts around May 1968 and the controversies over the post-World War II Security Pact, the AMPO Treaty, that saw Japan essentially becoming a satellite of the United States, both socially and politically. This has been a point that several critics have drawn attention to as kind of manifesting itself as some kind of ghost or spectre that haunts the otherwise sort of disturbingly flat and anodyne and empty vision of Japan that we see in this film, the lack of any real identifying landmarks associated with space, that makes this film, as I suggested before, something more universal and specific. And this is a tension, I think, this sense about the extent to which there is a specific Japaneseness that strikes at the heart of what key films like this and like Hanabi were doing in the late 90s and into the new millennium. And that, I think, led to a more pervasive inquiry into Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese identity. And that makes films like Kitano's and Kurosawa's and several others really important works in defining a new Japanese cinema in the 90s and in the new millennium. So if you've seen Cure, then let me know what you thought. Comment below. Like and subscribe. If you haven't seen Cure, then dash out immediately. Drop everything that you're doing and watch it immediately. And thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for more content in the very near future.